Hey guys, so picture this. You wake up in 9th century Scandinavia, and the first thing you smell isn't coffee brewing, it's smoke. Lots of smoke. Mixed with the delightful aroma of unwashed humans, wet wool, and something that might be breakfast, but could also be last week's leftovers fermenting in a corner. Welcome to Viking daily life, where central heating was a distant dream and personal hygiene was more of a seasonal suggestion than a daily practice. And honestly, I know what you're thinking. Oh great, another video about Vikings being savage warriors who spent all day pillaging and drinking mead. Yeah, well, plot twist. Most Vikings never left their villages, like ever. The majority of these so-called fearsome raiders were actually farmers who got up at dawn to milk cows and spent their evenings trying to figure out why their turnips kept dying. Romantic, right? Nope. But here's the thing that'll blow your mind. Viking daily life was way more complex and, frankly, way more interesting than Hollywood wants you to believe. These people weren't just running around with horned helmets screaming about Valhalla. They were dealing with the same stuff we deal with today: work stress, family drama, bad weather, and trying to figure out what to have for dinner when you've already eaten fish for the past 6 days straight. So grab your imaginary fur cloak, because we're about to dive deep into what it was actually like to live as a Viking. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll never look at your morning routine the same way again. I mean, come on, at least you don't have to check if your house is still standing every time the wind picks up, right? Let me set the scene for you. We're talking about roughly 793 to 1066 CE. That's about 300 years of Viking Age awesomeness. But before you start imagining some medieval paradise, let me paint you the real picture. Scandinavia during this period was basically nature's way of saying, let's see how tough humans really are. The climate was harsh. We're talking about a place where winter lasted for what felt like 17 months. And summer was that 1 week in July, when you could actually see the ground without snow on it. The Little Ice Age was just around the corner, making everything even more miserable than it already was. Imagine trying to grow crops when your growing season is shorter than a TikTok video, and your soil is basically frozen rocks with delusions of fertility. But here's where it gets interesting. The Vikings didn't just survive this environment, they thrived in it. And they did it through a combination of incredible resourcefulness, community cooperation, and what I can only describe as aggressive optimism. Like, sure, the sun hasn't shown its face in 3 months. But hey, at least the fish are still biting through the ice. The social structure was surprisingly sophisticated for a bunch of people who supposedly spent all their time hitting things with axes. At the top, you had the Jarls, basically the rich kids who owned all the good land and got to wear the fanciest brooches. Then came the Carls, the free farmers who made up the majority of Viking society. These were your middle-class Vikings, if you will. They owned their land, could carry weapons, and had the right to speak at the local assembly, which was basically medieval democracy with more beards. At the bottom were the thralls, slaves captured during raids or born into bondage. And yeah, I know, slavery is awful, but it was unfortunately a huge part of Viking economy and daily life. Some estimates suggest that up to 25% of the Viking population were thralls. They did the hardest, most dangerous work, and their lives were entirely at the mercy of their owners. But here's what's fascinating: social mobility was actually possible in Viking society. A thrall could earn or buy their freedom and become a carl. A successful carl could become wealthy enough to challenge the Jarls. It wasn't common, but it happened. Compare that to medieval Europe, where you were basically stuck in whatever social class you were born into until you died. The Vikings also had this thing called the Thing, and no, it's not what you're thinking. The Thing was their local assembly, where free men could gather to settle disputes, make laws, and basically argue about everything from property boundaries to who was responsible for that missing pig. It was democracy in action, complete with all the shouting and finger pointing you'd expect. Women in Viking society had way more rights than their counterparts in most of medieval Europe. They could own property, request divorces, and run businesses. Some even became Vilalvas, mystical seeresses, who were consulted on everything from weather predictions to battle outcomes. Basically, they were the original girl bosses, except with more rune stones and fewer PowerPoint presentations. The Vikings were also surprisingly clean for medieval standards. They bathed regularly, at least once a week, which was practically revolutionary for the time. They even had a special day for it Saturday, which they called Washing Day. Meanwhile, their Christian neighbors were still debating whether bathing was a sin because it involved being naked. Religion played a huge role in daily life, but it wasn't the simple worship Odin and go to Valhalla narrative you see in movies. The Vikings had a complex pantheon of gods and goddesses, each with their own personalities, quirks, and areas of expertise. Odin was the wise, but somewhat untrustworthy All-Father. Thor was the straightforward hammer-wielding protector. Freyr and Freyja governed fertility and prosperity. And Loki was basically that friend who always starts drama at parties. But they also believed in land spirits, house spirits, and ancestor worship. Every farm had its own protective spirits that needed to be kept happy with offerings and proper behavior. Disrespect the spirits, and your crops would fail, your animals would get sick, and your all would turn sour. It was like having invisible, supernatural landlords who were always watching and judging your life choices. The concept of fate or word was central to Viking thinking. They believed that everyone's destiny was already woven by the Norns, the three sisters who controlled fate. But here's the twist: knowing your fate was predetermined didn't make Vikings passive. Instead, it made them focus on how they faced their destiny. Courage, honor, and reputation were what mattered, because those were the things that would be remembered after you died. This brings us to their famous death obsession. Yes, Vikings thought a lot about death, but not in a morbid way. They saw death as just another adventure, and they wanted to make sure they died well. A good death meant dying bravely in battle, or at least facing your end with dignity and courage. The worst thing that could happen to a Viking wasn't dying, it was dying in a way that brought shame to your family name. So let's talk about what actually filled a Viking's day, starting with the moment they dragged themselves out of their fur-covered sleeping area and faced another day of medieval survival. The Viking day started early, and when I say early, I mean the rooster is still considering whether it's worth getting up early. Dawn was go time, because in a world without electric lights, you worked when there was light and slept when there wasn't. Simple as that. But first, let's address the elephant in the longhouse. Where exactly did Vikings sleep? Forget your cozy bedroom with blackout curtains and a memory foam mattress. Viking sleeping arrangements were more like a medieval slumber party that never ended. Except everyone snored, someone always had a cold, and the family goat might be sharing your space. The typical Viking longhouse was exactly what it sounds like long. We're talking structures that could stretch up to 250 feet, though most were more modest at around 50-100 feet. Inside, it was basically one big room with a central hearth running down the middle and raised sleeping platforms along the walls. These platforms were stuffed with straw, moss, or whatever soft material they could find, then covered with furs and woolen blankets. Privacy. What's privacy? The entire extended family, parents, children, grandparents, unmarried siblings, and sometimes even the hired help, all slept in the same space. The only separation might be a hanging curtain or a wooden partition, if you were particularly fancy. Imagine trying to have a private conversation or intimate moment with your spouse when your mother-in-law is literally 6 feet away pretending to be asleep. The sleeping arrangements followed a strict hierarchy. The head of the household and his wife got the best spot, usually the platform closest to the high seat, which was positioned opposite the main entrance. This wasn't just about comfort. It was about being able to see who was coming and going, and being in the position of honor when receiving guests. Children slept wherever there was space, often piled together like puppies. Servants and thralls got the spots closest to the door, the coldest and least secure positions. And yes, animals often shared the space too. Cows, sheep, and pigs might be brought inside during the harshest weather, because a live animal was worth more than your comfort or your sense of smell. The wake-up call wasn't an alarm clock. It was usually the sound of someone stoking the fire back to life, the lowing of cattle that needed milking, or simply the gradual increase in activity as people started their daily routines. The first person up was typically the lady of the house or the senior female servant, because someone had to get the fire going and start preparing the morning meal. Getting dressed was an adventure in layering. Vikings were the original masters of the layered look, not for fashion, but for survival. The base layer was a linen undertunic if you were lucky enough to own one. Linen was expensive and had to be imported, so most people made do with wool directly against their skin. Over this went the main tunic for men, or a long dress for women, then a cloak or outer garment, and finally whatever accessories and weapons were needed for the day's activities. Shoes were precious commodities. Good leather boots could mean the difference between keeping your toes and losing them to frostbite. Most Vikings owned only one pair of shoes and took extremely good care of them. Going barefoot was common inside the house, but outside, proper footwear was essential. The wealthy might have shoes with iron studs for better grip on ice, while the poor made do with whatever animal hide they could get their hands on. Personal hygiene in the morning was surprisingly thorough by medieval standards. Vikings washed their faces and hands daily, combed their hair, and trimmed their beards. They had special combs made from bone or antler, and these weren't just functional, they were often beautifully decorated and served as status symbols. A well-made comb was a prized possession that might be passed down through generations. The morning wash wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about respect. Appearing unkempt in public was considered disrespectful to your family and your community. Even thralls were expected to maintain basic cleanliness, though they obviously had fewer resources to work with. But here's where it gets interesting. Vikings were obsessed with their hair. Both men and women spent considerable time on their hairstyles, and hair was seen as a symbol of strength and vitality. Men often wore their hair long and braided, sometimes with beads or metal ornaments woven in. Women's hairstyles were even more elaborate, with complex braids and knots that could take hours to create and maintain. Losing your hair was considered not just unfortunate, but potentially shameful. There are records of Vikings using various concoctions to prevent baldness or promote hair growth, including mixtures of bear fat, herbs, and other ingredients that probably smelled about as good as they sound. The morning routine also included a quick check of the weather and the animals. In a society where your survival depended on your livestock and crops, the first priority was always making sure everything was still alive and accounted for. Cows needed milking, chickens needed feeding, and sheep needed to be let out to pasture if the weather permitted. For the women of the household, the morning meant starting the day's bread. Viking bread wasn't the fluffy, white stuff we're used to. It was dense, dark, and made from whatever grains were available: barley, oats, rye, or a mixture of all three. The bread was often flat and hard, designed to last for weeks or even months without spoiling. Fresh bread was a luxury. Most of the time, people ate bread that was several days old and required serious jaw strength to consume. The men, meanwhile, were checking their tools and weapons, planning the day's work, and discussing any community business that needed attention. Even farmers carried weapons, axes, spears, or knives, because you never knew when you might need to defend your property or when an opportunity for a profitable raid might present itself. And here's something that might surprise you: Vikings were early adopters of what we'd now call work-life balance. They understood that all work and no play made for a miserable existence. Even the busiest farming days included time for storytelling, games, and social interaction. Community was everything in Viking society, and maintaining social bonds was considered just as important as maintaining your crops. The morning meal was usually simple leftover stew from the night before. Some bread, maybe some cheese or dried fish if you were lucky. But it was eaten communally, with the entire household gathering around the central hearth. This wasn't just about nutrition, it was about reinforcing family bonds and planning the day's activities together. Children weren't exempt from morning responsibilities. By age 5 or 6, Viking children were expected to contribute to the household in whatever way they could. Boys might help with animal care or simple farming tasks, while girls learned cooking, weaving, and household management. But they also had time for play, and Viking children had toys, wooden swords, dolls, board games, and balls made from inflated animal bladders. The morning routine set the tone for the entire day, and Vikings understood this intuitively. Starting the day with purpose, cleanliness, and community connection wasn't just practical, it was essential for maintaining the social fabric that kept everyone alive and thriving in a harsh environment. So there you have it, the Viking morning routine. No snooze button, no coffee, no hot shower, but plenty of community spirit, personal pride, and the kind of practical wisdom that kept an entire civilization thriving in one of the world's most challenging environments. And honestly, there's something kind of admirable about people who could face each day with such determination and grace, even when that day might include having to chase escaped pigs through a snowstorm while wearing shoes made from cow intestines. Now, let's talk about what happened after the Vikings got themselves together and faced the day, because this is where things get really interesting. So let's talk about Viking work life, because contrary to popular belief, most Vikings weren't spending their days pillaging monasteries and drinking mead from the skulls of their enemies. I mean, some were, but they were basically the medieval equivalent of extreme sports enthusiasts, a small, highly visible minority that everyone talks about, but most people never actually meet. The reality? Most Vikings were farmers. And not just any farmers, they were farmers trying to grow crops in a climate that was actively hostile to agriculture. Imagine trying to run a farm where your growing season lasts about as long as a Marvel movie. Your soil is basically frozen gravel with commitment issues, and your main fertilizer comes from animals that you also depend on for milk, meat, and warmth. It's like playing Farmville on expert mode, except if you lose, you starve. The Viking agricultural year was a carefully choreographed dance with nature, and nature was not a cooperative dance partner. Spring planting had to happen in a narrow window when the ground finally thawed, but before the brief growing season ran out. Vikings grew barley, oats, rye, and some wheat, along with vegetables like onions, leeks, cabbage, and peas. They also cultivated flax for making linen, though this was more of a luxury crop since it required better soil and more favorable conditions. But here's where Vikings got creative. They were masters of diversification. They didn't just farm, they fished, hunted, raised livestock, and foraged for wild foods. A typical Viking household might have cows for milk and meat, sheep for wool and mutton, pigs for bacon and lard, chickens for eggs, and goats for milk and cheese. They also kept horses, which were not just for transportation, but were also a source of meat when times got tough. Fishing was huge in Viking culture. And I mean that literally. Some Viking fishing expeditions were basically small-scale military operations, with dozens of boats and hundreds of people involved. They caught cod, herring, salmon, and whatever else was swimming around in the North Sea and Baltic. Fish was preserved by drying, smoking, or salting, and it formed a crucial part of the Viking diet year-round. The work was divided along gender lines, but not in the way you might expect. Yes, men typically handled the heavy agricultural work, animal husbandry, and fishing, but Viking women had enormous responsibilities and considerable autonomy. They managed the household finances, oversaw food production and preservation, supervised servants and slaves, and ran the farm when their husbands were away on trading expeditions or raids. Viking women were also responsible for textile production, which was way more important than it sounds. In a world without Walmart, every piece of clothing, every blanket, every sail had to be made by hand. Women raised sheep, processed wool, spun thread, wove cloth, and sewed garments. They also made the sails for Viking ships, which were massive undertakings requiring incredible skill and coordination. A single sail might require the work of dozens of women over several months. But let's talk about the men's work for a moment, because Viking farming was not for the weak. These guys were basically medieval CrossFit athletes, except their gym was a frozen wasteland, and their workout equipment was made of iron and wood. Ploughing was done with simple wooden ploughs pulled by oxen or horses, and it was back-breaking work. Harvesting was done by hand with sickles and scythes, and every grain of barley had to be cut, gathered, and processed manually. Then there was the endless cycle of maintenance and construction. Viking farms required constant upkeep, fences needed repair, buildings needed maintenance, tools needed sharpening, and new structures were always being built or expanded. Vikings were skilled carpenters, blacksmiths, and general handymen by necessity. You couldn't call a contractor when your roof started leaking, you fixed it yourself or you got wet. The seasonal rhythm of work was intense but predictable. Spring was planting season, with long days of preparing fields and sowing crops. Summer was maintenance season, tending crops, haymaking, and preparing for winter. Autumn was harvest time, the most critical period of the year, when everything had to be gathered, processed, and stored before winter set in. And winter was craft season, when Vikings spent the long, dark months making tools, weapons, clothing, and everything else they'd need for the coming year. But here's what's really interesting: Vikings were also entrepreneurs. They didn't just produce for their own consumption, they produced for trade. Viking merchants traveled incredible distances, trading everything from amber and furs to iron and slaves. A successful Viking farmer might also be a part-time trader, taking surplus goods to market towns and bringing back exotic items like silk, spices, and silver. The famous Viking raids were actually just one part of a much larger economic system. Yes, they raided monasteries and coastal settlements, but they also established trading posts, founded cities, and created extensive commercial networks that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople. They were basically the medieval equivalent of a global corporation, except with more axes and fewer quarterly reports. Viking craftsmanship was legendary, and for good reason. These people could work with wood, metal, bone, antler, leather, and stone to create everything from simple tools to elaborate works of art. Viking blacksmiths produced weapons and tools that were prized throughout Europe. Their shipbuilders created vessels that were centuries ahead of their time in terms of design and functionality. Their jewelers and metalworkers created intricate brooches, arm rings, and other decorative items that are still admired today. But it wasn't just about the final product, it was about the process. Viking craftsmanship was a community activity. The local blacksmith didn't work in isolation. He was part of a network of specialists who shared knowledge, techniques, and resources. A single sword might involve the work of several craftsmen, one to smelt the iron, another to forge the blade, a third to create the hilt, and a fourth to decorate the finished weapon. The workday was long but not necessarily continuous. Vikings understood the importance of pacing themselves, especially during the intense periods of planting and harvest. Work was broken up with meals, rest periods, and social interaction. The midday meal was often eaten in the fields, and it was a chance for workers to rest, share news, and maintain the social bonds that held the community together. Children learned by doing. There were no schools in the modern sense. Education happened through apprenticeship and observation. Boys learned farming, crafting, and fighting by working alongside their fathers and other men in the community. Girls learned household management, textile production, and child care by helping their mothers and other women. By their teens, most Viking children were skilled contributors to their household's economy. The work wasn't just about survival, it was about reputation. In Viking society, your worth was measured not just by what you owned, but by what you could do. A man who was skilled at farming, crafting, and fighting was respected and sought after as an ally. A woman who could manage a household, produce high-quality textiles, and maintain social relationships was equally valued. And here's something that might surprise you: Vikings had what we'd now call sick days and vacation time. If someone was injured or ill, the community rallied to help with their work. If a family's breadwinner died, the community ensured that the widow and children were cared for. And during the winter months, when agricultural work was impossible, Vikings had time for leisure activities, socializing, and what we might call professional development, learning new skills and techniques. The work was hard, dangerous, and never-ending, but it was also meaningful in a way that many modern jobs aren't. Every task had a clear purpose: survival, prosperity, and the continuation of the family line. There was no such thing as busy work or meaningless bureaucracy. If you were working, it was because that work was essential to your community's survival and success. Vikings also understood the importance of innovation and adaptation. They constantly experimented with new techniques, tools, and methods. They were early adopters of new technologies and weren't afraid to borrow ideas from other cultures. This flexibility and openness to change was one of the keys to their success in such a challenging environment. The workday ended when the light failed or when the essential tasks were completed, whichever came first. But the end of the workday didn't mean the end of productivity. Evenings were often spent on indoor crafts, storytelling games, and social activities that maintained community bonds and passed on cultural knowledge. And that brings us to one of the most important aspects of Viking daily life: the evening meal and the social activities that followed. Because if you think Vikings were all work and no play, you're in for a surprise. These people knew how to party, medieval style. The evening meal was the social highlight of the Viking day, and it was way more than just dinner. It was community theatre, news broadcast, business meeting, and entertainment center all rolled into one. The main meal of the day was eaten in the early evening, when the day's work was done, and everyone could gather around the central hearth of the longhouse. But let's talk about the food first, because Viking cuisine was, well, let's just say it was an adventure for your taste buds, and not always in a good way. The staple foods were bread, porridge, dairy products, and whatever meat or fish was available. Vegetables were limited to what could be grown in the short northern growing season or preserved through the winter. Meat was a luxury for most Vikings, eaten mainly on special occasions or when an animal died or was slaughtered. Beef, pork, mutton, goat and horse were all on the menu, along with wild game like deer, elk and boar. But the most common protein was fish dried, smoked, salted, or fresh when available. Cod, herring, and salmon were staples, and Vikings developed sophisticated techniques for preserving fish that could last for months. Dairy products were crucial to the Viking diet. Milk was consumed fresh when available, but most of it was processed into cheese, butter, or skyr, a thick, yogurt-like product that's still popular in Iceland today. These dairy products were high in protein and fat, essential for surviving the harsh northern climate. The bread was dense and dark, made from barley, oats, or rye. It was often baked in flat loaves that could be stored for weeks without spoiling. Fresh bread was a treat. Most of the time, people ate bread that was several days old and required serious jaw muscles to consume. Sometimes the bread was so hard it had to be soaked in ile or milk before it could be eaten. Vegetables included onions, leeks, cabbage, peas, and beans, along with wild plants like nettles, sorrel, and various herbs. These were often cooked into stews or soups, which were the most common way of preparing meals. A big pot of stew could feed the entire household and could be kept simmering over the fire for days, with new ingredients added as they became available. Seasoning was limited but important. Salt was precious and had to be traded for or extracted from seawater. Herbs like dill, caraway, and juniper berries were used for flavoring, and honey was the primary sweetener. Imported spices were luxury items that only the wealthy could afford. The cooking was done over the central hearth, using iron pots, wooden bowls, and simple utensils. There were no ovens in the modern sense. Bread was baked on flat stones or in clay ovens built into the hearth. Meat was roasted on spits or boiled in large cauldrons. Everything was cooked over an open fire, which required considerable skill to avoid burning the food or filling the house with smoke. But here's where it gets interesting. The evening meal wasn't just about eating. It was about community. The entire household gathered around the hearth, from the head of the family down to the lowliest thrall. Seating was arranged by status, with the most important people getting the best spots, near the fire, and the choicest portions of food. The meal began with the head of the household making a toast, usually to the gods, to absent friends, or to the success of upcoming ventures. Everyone drank from shared horns or wooden cups, and the ale or mead was passed around the circle. Drinking wasn't just about getting drunk, though that certainly happened. It was about bonding and showing respect for your companions. Conversation during the meal covered everything from local gossip to international news brought by traveling merchants. Vikings were surprisingly well informed about events happening far from their homes, thanks to their extensive trading networks and the constant movement of people throughout the Viking world. After the meal came the entertainment, and this is where Viking culture really shined. Storytelling was the primary form of entertainment, and it was taken very seriously. Professional storytellers, called skalds, were highly respected members of society who could recite epic poems and sagas from memory. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were history, moral instruction, and cultural preservation all in one. The sagas told the stories of gods and heroes, of great battles and tragic love affairs, of clever tricks and terrible vengeance. They were passed down orally from generation to generation, and each telling might be slightly different, allowing the stories to evolve and adapt to new audiences and circumstances. But it wasn't just professional storytellers who entertained the household. Everyone was expected to contribute something: a song, a joke, a riddle, or a story of their own. Children learned by listening and eventually participating, and even thralls might be called upon to share news or stories from their homelands. Music was also important, though Viking musical instruments were simple by modern standards. They had lyres, flutes, and drums, and singing was a popular form of entertainment. Some songs were religious, honoring the gods or asking for their protection. Others were secular, telling stories of love, adventure, or everyday life. Games were another popular evening activity. Vikings played board games like Nefertofel, a strategic game similar to chess, but with asymmetrical sides. One player commanded a king and his defenders, while the other controlled a larger force of attackers. They also played dice games, riddle contests, and various physical games that tested strength, skill, or endurance. Drinking was a serious business in Viking culture. But it wasn't just about getting drunk. Ale and mead were safer to drink than water in many cases, and they provided calories and nutrients that were important for survival. The brewing of ale was typically done by women, and it was considered a crucial household skill. A woman who could brew good ale was highly valued, both as a wife and as a member of the community. The drinking rituals were elaborate and meaningful. Toasts were made to the gods, to dead heroes, to living friends, and to future success. The order in which people drank, the words they spoke, and the way they held their drinking horns all had significance. Breaking the rules of drinking etiquette could be a serious social offense. But the evening wasn't all fun and games. It was also when important business was conducted. Marriages were arranged, trade deals were negotiated, and disputes were settled. The relaxed atmosphere and the social bonding that came with shared meals and drinks made it easier to reach agreements and resolve conflicts. The evening was also when cultural knowledge was passed down. Children learned about their family history, their religious beliefs, and their social obligations through stories and conversations. They learned practical skills by watching and helping with evening crafts. They learned social skills by observing how adults interacted with each other. As the evening wore on and the fire burned lower, people gradually drifted off to their sleeping areas. But the social bonds formed during these evening gatherings were the glue that held Viking society together. In a harsh environment where survival depended on cooperation, these daily rituals of sharing food, drink, and stories were essential for maintaining the trust and solidarity that kept communities functioning. The evening meal and its aftermath were also when Vikings dealt with their emotions and psychological needs. The harsh realities of medieval life, death, disease, violence, and constant uncertainty were processed through storytelling, ritual, and community support. The evening gathering was a form of group therapy, allowing people to share their fears, hopes, and experiences in a supportive environment. And here's something that might surprise you: Vikings were early adopters of what we'd now call work-life balance. They understood that all work and no play made for a miserable and ultimately unproductive existence. The evening social time wasn't seen as a luxury or a waste of time. It was seen as essential for maintaining the social fabric that made everything else possible. The evening also served practical purposes. It was when the next day's work was planned, when resources were allocated, and when decisions were made about everything from crop rotation to marriage alliances. The informal atmosphere made it easier to discuss sensitive topics and reach consensus on difficult decisions. For young people, the evening social time was crucial for learning adult roles and responsibilities. They observed how their elders handled conflicts, made decisions, and maintained relationships. They learned the stories and traditions that would guide their own lives, and they began to form the social connections that would be important throughout their lives. The evening gathering was also when Vikings dealt with their spiritual needs. Prayers were offered to the gods, protective rituals were performed, and the community's relationship with the supernatural world was maintained. This wasn't separate from the social and practical aspects of the evening. It was integrated into everything they did. As winter nights grew longer, these evening gatherings became even more important. During the darkest months of the year, when outdoor work was impossible and people were confined to their longhouses for weeks at a time, the social activities that filled the long evenings were literally what kept people sane and communities intact. The evening meal and its aftermath were the heart of Viking social life, the time when a collection of individuals became a community, when practical needs were met through social interaction, and when the culture was passed on to the next generation. It was democracy in action, entertainment and education combined, and group therapy all rolled into one daily ritual that was as essential to Viking survival as farming, fighting, or sailing. Now, let's dive into something that Hollywood definitely doesn't show you about Vikings: their surprisingly sophisticated approach to personal hygiene and beauty standards. Because believe it or not, these savage raiders were actually some of the cleanest people in medieval Europe. Here's something that'll blow your mind. Vikings were so obsessed with personal cleanliness that their Christian neighbors actually complained about it. Yeah, you heard that right. The supposedly civilized Christians were griping that these pagan barbarians were too clean and too attractive, and it was making their own women dissatisfied with their unwashed Christian husbands. Talk about medieval relationship drama, right? Saturday was literally called washing day in Old Norse lagadaga, and it wasn't optional. While most of medieval Europe was still debating whether bathing was sinful because it involved nudity, Vikings were out here taking weekly baths like it was the most natural thing in the world. They built saunas, heated bathhouses, and even had portable bathing equipment for when they were traveling or on raids. The Viking beauty routine was elaborate and taken seriously by both men and women. They had combs made from bone or antler, often beautifully decorated and carried in special cases. These weren't just functional items, they were status symbols. A well-made comb was a prized possession that might be passed down through generations or given as a valuable gift. Hair care was serious business. Vikings believed that healthy, well-groomed hair was a sign of strength, vitality, and social status. Both men and women wore their hair long, and the styles were complex and time-consuming. Men often braided their hair and beards, sometimes incorporating beads, rings, or other ornaments. Women's hairstyles were even more elaborate, with intricate braids, knots, and decorative elements that could take hours to create. They had specialized tools for hair care, not just combs, but also hairpins, clips, and even primitive curling irons made from metal that could be heated in the fire. They used various oils and preparations to keep their hair healthy and shiny, including bear grease, which was apparently the medieval equivalent of premium hair conditioner. Beard care for men was an art form. A well-groomed beard was essential for any self-respecting Viking man, and the styles varied from simple and practical to elaborate and decorative. Some men braided their beards, others waxed them into specific shapes, and many incorporated jewelry or ornaments. Losing your beard was considered deeply shameful. It was sometimes used as a form of punishment or humiliation. But it wasn't just about hair. Vikings were also surprisingly advanced in dental hygiene. They used to-do. So let's talk about Viking dental hygiene, because this is where things get really interesting. These people were using toothpicks made from twigs, cleaning their teeth with rough cloths, and even performing primitive dental procedures. Archaeological evidence shows that Vikings had surprisingly good teeth for medieval people, which makes sense when you consider that sugar wasn't readily available and their diet was mostly natural, unprocessed foods. They also used various herbs and preparations for oral care. Juniper berries were chewed to freshen breath, and certain plants were used to treat toothaches and gum problems. Some Vikings even filed decorative grooves into their teeth and filled them with colored materials, basically medieval dental bling. Imagine showing up to a raid with your teeth literally sparkling with inlaid gold or silver. That's some next-level intimidation tactics right there. Skincare was another area where Vikings were surprisingly advanced. They used various animal fats and plant oils to protect their skin from the harsh northern climate. Seal oil was particularly prized for its protective properties, and it was often mixed with herbs or other ingredients to create primitive moisturizers and healing balms. Both men and women used cosmetics, though the styles and applications differed. Women used various preparations to enhance their complexion, darken their eyebrows, and add color to their lips and cheeks. Men might use similar preparations, especially for special occasions or when trying to impress someone. The famous kohl-rimmed eyes that we see in popular depictions of Vikings might actually have some basis in reality, as both men and women used dark preparations around their eyes, possibly for both cosmetic and practical purposes. The dark color could help reduce glare from snow and ice. Perfumes and scents were important too. Vikings used various aromatic herbs, flowers, and even imported spices to create pleasant scents. They understood that smelling good was part of being attractive and socially acceptable. Some of the most prized trade goods were exotic perfumes and aromatic substances from distant lands. The bathing process itself was elaborate and social. Viking bathhouses were communal spaces where people gathered not just to get clean, but to socialize, conduct business, and maintain relationships. The bathhouse was a place where social barriers were somewhat relaxed. You might find yourself sitting next to someone of a different social class, and the shared vulnerability of being naked and clean created a different kind of social dynamic. They had specialized bathing equipment, wooden tubs, bronze or iron basins, and even portable bathing kits for travel. The wealthy might have elaborate bathing setups with multiple tubs, heated water, and attendants to help with the process. But even ordinary Vikings took their bathing seriously and made sure they had the necessary equipment and supplies. The cleaning process involved more than just water. Vikings used soap made from animal fats and ash, which was surprisingly effective. They also used various scrubbing implements, rough cloths, brushes made from animal hair, and even pumice stones for removing dead skin and calluses. The goal wasn't just to remove dirt, but to achieve a level of cleanliness that met their high standards. Personal grooming extended beyond just cleanliness to include nail care, ear cleaning, and even primitive forms of cosmetic surgery. Vikings trimmed and shaped their nails, cleaned their ears with specialized tools, and some even underwent procedures to alter their appearance, scarification, tattooing, and other forms of body modification that served both aesthetic and spiritual purposes. So let's talk about Viking clothing and fashion, because these people were way more style-conscious than you might expect. Forget the Hollywood image of Vikings wearing nothing but rough furs and leather loincloths. Real Viking fashion was sophisticated, colorful, and surprisingly varied, with distinct styles for different occasions, social classes, and regions. The basic Viking wardrobe was built around practicality, but that didn't mean it was boring. Men typically wore a linen or wool undertunic, covered by a longer outer tunic that reached to about mid-thigh. Over this went trousers, not the baggy, shapeless things you see in movies, but fitted leg coverings that were often quite tailored and stylish. The trousers were held up by a belt and sometimes had decorative elements like embroidered cuffs or contrasting trim. Women's clothing was more complex and varied. The basic outfit consisted of a long linen undergarment, over which went a woolen dress or gown. But here's where it gets interesting. Viking women also wore what's called a handjarok, or apron dress, which was essentially a sleeveless overdress held up by shoulder straps and fastened with distinctive oval brooches. These brooches weren't just functional, they were major status symbols and works of art in their own right. The colors were way more vibrant than you'd expect. Vikings had access to a wide range of dyes made from local plants, minerals, and imported materials. Red was particularly popular and was made from madder root or imported cochineal. Blue came from woad or imported indigo. Yellow was made from various plants, and green was created by combining blue and yellow dyes. The wealthy could afford more exotic colors and more complex dyeing processes, resulting in clothing that was literally eye-catching. Fabric quality varied enormously based on social status and wealth. The poor made do with coarse wool and rough linen, while the wealthy wore fine woolen cloth, imported silk, and high-quality linen that was almost as soft as cotton. The weaving was done by hand on vertical looms, and skilled weavers could create complex patterns, textures, and designs that rivaled anything produced in medieval Europe. Embroidery and decoration were important elements of Viking fashion. Clothing was often decorated with embroidered patterns, metallic threads, and applied ornaments. These decorations weren't just pretty, they served as indicators of social status, regional identity, and personal taste. A well-dressed Viking might wear clothing that told a story about their wealth, their travels, their family connections, and their personal achievements. Accessories were crucial to the complete Viking look. Both men and women wore jewelry, arm rings, finger rings, necklaces, and brooches. These weren't just decorative, they served as portable wealth status indicators, and sometimes even currency. A wealthy Viking might literally wear their fortune in the form of silver arm rings and gold brooches. Belts were particularly important for men, as they held not just the clothing together, but also carried essential tools and weapons. A typical Viking man's belt might hold a knife, a purse, keys, and various other implements. The belt itself was often decorated and could be a significant status symbol. Wealthy men might have belts with silver or gold fittings, while ordinary farmers made do with simple leather straps. Footwear was both practical and stylish. Viking shoes were typically made from leather and were designed to be waterproof, warm, and durable. But they also came in various styles and qualities. The wealthy might have shoes with decorative stitching, metal fittings, or even imported materials. Some Viking shoes were surprisingly sophisticated, with multiple layers, reinforced soles, and complex construction techniques. Cloaks were essential outer garments that served multiple purposes. They provided warmth and weather protection, but they were also fashion statements. Cloaks came in various lengths, colors, and materials, and they were often fastened with elaborate brooches or pins. A good cloak was a major investment and might last for many years, so Vikings chose them carefully. Seasonal clothing variations were important in a climate with such extreme weather differences. Summer clothing was lighter and more colorful, while winter gear was heavy, layered, and designed for maximum warmth. Vikings were masters of layering, and they understood how to dress for different activities and weather conditions. The clothing also varied by occupation and social role. Farmers wore practical, durable clothing that could withstand hard work and rough conditions. Warriors had specialized gear that combined protection with mobility. Merchants wore clothing that displayed their wealth and international connections. Religious figures had their own distinctive styles that reflected their spiritual roles. Clothing maintenance was a constant concern. In a world without washing machines or dry cleaners, keeping clothes clean and in good repair required considerable effort and skill. Vikings had specialized techniques for cleaning different types of fabric, removing stains, and repairing damage. They also had methods for protecting clothing from insects, moisture, and other threats. The production of clothing was a major part of the household economy. Women were responsible for most textile production, from raising sheep and processing wool to spinning thread, weaving cloth, and sewing garments. This wasn't just busy work, it was skilled labor that required years of training and experience. A woman who could produce high-quality textiles was valuable both to her own family and to the broader community. So let's talk about Viking food culture, because their relationship with food was way more complex and interesting than just meat, ale, and whatever didn't kill you. Vikings were actually sophisticated food producers, processors, and even gourmets who understood nutrition, preservation, and the social importance of meals in ways that might surprise you. The Viking diet was incredibly diverse, considering the challenging climate and limited growing season. They were masters of food preservation, developing techniques that allowed them to store food for months or even years. Smoking, salting, drying, and fermentation were all used to preserve meat, fish, dairy products, and vegetables. Some of these preservation methods were so effective that the food could remain edible for longer than many modern processed foods. Fishing was absolutely crucial to Viking survival, and they developed sophisticated techniques for catching, processing, and preserving fish. Cod was particularly important. It could be dried into a hard, lightweight product that was perfect for long sea voyages or winter storage. The dried cod was so hard it had to be beaten with hammers before it could be eaten, but it was incredibly nutritious and could last for years without spoiling. Herring was another staple, and Vikings developed complex seasonal fishing operations that involved entire communities. During herring season, everyone from children to elderly people participated in catching, processing, and preserving the fish. The work was intense but crucial. A successful herring season could mean the difference between surviving the winter and starving. Salmon was prized both fresh and preserved, and Vikings developed sophisticated techniques for smoking and curing salmon that are still used today. They also caught freshwater fish like trout and pike, and they weren't above eating whatever was available, including seals, whales, and various seabirds. But Vikings weren't just fishermen, they were also skilled hunters who pursued everything from deer and elk to bears and wild boar. Hunting wasn't just about getting meat, it was also about obtaining furs, bones, antlers, and other materials that were essential for daily life. A successful hunt provided not just food but also raw materials for clothing, tools, and trade goods. Domestic animals were incredibly important to Viking life, but they were managed very differently than modern livestock. Cattle were particularly valuable. They provided milk, meat, leather, and horn, and they were also used for ploughing and transportation. But cattle were expensive to maintain and required good pasture, so most Vikings could only afford a few animals. sheep were more practical for most households. They provided wool for clothing, milk for cheese, and meat when necessary. Sheep could also survive on poorer pasture than cattle, making them more suitable for the marginal lands that many Vikings farmed. Goats were even hardier and could survive in areas where other animals struggled. Pigs were the most efficient meat producers, converting scraps and waste into high-quality protein. Viking pigs were allowed to forage in forests and waste areas, eating acorns, roots, and whatever else they could find. They required minimal care and could be slaughtered when meat was needed. Chickens provided eggs and occasional meat, and they were relatively easy to maintain. Viking chickens were smaller and hardier than modern breeds, and they were good at finding their own food. Eggs were particularly valuable because they could be preserved for months using various techniques. The preparation of food was both an art and a science. Vikings developed sophisticated cooking techniques that maximized nutrition and flavor, while working with limited ingredients and simple equipment. Stews and soups were particularly important because they made the most of available ingredients and could be kept warm over the fire for extended periods. Bread was a staple, but Viking bread was very different from modern bread. It was dense, dark, and made from whatever grains were available. Barley was the most common grain, followed by oats and rye. Wheat was a luxury crop that required better soil and climate conditions. The bread was often flat and unleavened, designed to last for weeks without spoiling. Dairy products were crucial to the Viking diet, providing essential fats and proteins. Milk was consumed fresh when available, but most of it was processed into cheese, butter, or skyr. These products could be stored for months and provided essential nutrition during the winter when fresh food was scarce. Vikings also consumed a surprising variety of vegetables and wild plants. They grew onions, leeks, cabbage, peas, and beans in their gardens, and they gathered wild plants like nettles, sorrel, and various berries. These plant foods provided essential vitamins and minerals that prevented nutritional deficiency diseases. Beverages were important both for nutrition and for social reasons. Ale was the most common drink, brewed from barley or other grains. It was safer than water in many cases and provided calories and nutrients. Mead, made from fermented honey, was a luxury drink reserved for special occasions. Wine was imported and extremely expensive, available only to the wealthy. The social aspects of food were just as important as the nutritional aspects. Meals were communal events that reinforced social bonds and hierarchies. The quality and quantity of food served reflected the host's wealth and status, and the seating arrangements and serving order reflected social relationships. Feasting was a crucial part of Viking culture, serving political, social, and religious functions. Great feasts marked important occasions like weddings, funerals, religious festivals, and the conclusion of important business deals. These events could last for days and involved enormous quantities of food and drink. So let's talk about Viking children and family life, because this is where you really see the human side of these supposedly fierce warriors. Viking children weren't just miniature adults waiting to grow up. They were valued members of the family and community who had their own roles, responsibilities, and surprisingly sophisticated educational system. Viking families were typically nuclear units consisting of parents and their children, though extended family members, servants, and slaves might also live in the same longhouse. The average Viking family had between 4 and 6 children, though infant mortality was high, and not all children survived to adulthood. This harsh reality meant that children who did survive were particularly precious and were given considerable attention and care. Childhood in Viking society was divided into distinct stages, each with its own expectations and responsibilities. Babies and toddlers were cared for primarily by their mothers and other women in the household, but fathers also played active roles in child care. Viking men were expected to be involved in their children's upbringing, and a man who neglected his children was considered to be failing in his basic duties. Children began taking on responsibilities at a very young age. By age 5 or 6, they were expected to help with simple household tasks like feeding chickens, gathering eggs, or helping with food preparation. This wasn't child labor in the modern sense, it was education. Children learned essential life skills by participating in the daily activities of the household. Boys and girls had different educational paths, but both were considered equally important. Boys learned farming, animal husbandry, crafts, and fighting skills by working alongside their fathers and other men. They learned to use tools, care for animals, and eventually to handle weapons. By their early teens, boys were expected to be competent in basic survival skills and to contribute meaningfully to the household economy. Girls learned household management, food preparation, textile production, and child care by working with their mothers and other women. But this wasn't just domestic drudgery. These skills were highly valued and essential for family survival. A woman who couldn't manage a household effectively could doom her entire family, so girls' education was taken very seriously. But Viking children also had time for play, and their toys and games were both fun and educational. Boys played with wooden swords, shields, and toy ships, learning the basics of combat and seamanship through play. Girls had dolls and miniature household items that taught them domestic skills. Both boys and girls played board games, ball games, and various physical activities that developed coordination, strategy, and social skills. Education wasn't formal in the modern sense, but it was comprehensive and practical. Children learned by observation, imitation, and gradual participation in adult activities. They also learned through storytelling, which was the primary method of transmitting cultural knowledge, moral values, and historical information. The relationship between parents and children was affectionate but not permissive. Viking parents loved their children deeply, but they also expected obedience and respect. Children who misbehaved were disciplined, but the discipline was usually proportionate and aimed at teaching proper behavior rather than simply punishing wrongdoing. Coming of age was marked by various rituals and ceremonies that recognized the transition from childhood to adulthood. For boys, this might involve their first successful hunt, their first raid, or a formal ceremony where they received their first adult weapons. For girls, it might be marked by their first successful completion of a major household project, like weaving their first piece of cloth or managing a feast. Marriage was typically arranged by parents, but young people had some say in the matter. A marriage that was completely against the wishes of both parties was unlikely to be successful, so parents usually tried to find matches that would be acceptable to their children, as well as beneficial to the families involved. The average age of marriage was probably in the late teens or early 20s. Children were also important for the family's economic future. They represented security in old age, continuation of the family line, and additional labor for the household, but they were also expensive to raise and required considerable investment of time, energy, and resources. Viking parents had to balance their affection for their children with the practical realities of survival in a harsh environment. The legal status of children was complex, but generally protective. Children had rights under Viking law, and parents who abused or neglected their children could face legal consequences. Children could also inherit property and had some legal standing in their own right, though their rights were limited compared to adults. Orphan children were typically cared for by extended family members or by the community as a whole. Viking society had strong traditions of mutual support, and a child who lost their parents wouldn't be abandoned. They might be formally adopted by relatives or taken in by other families who would raise them as their own. The education of children also included spiritual and moral instruction. Children learned about the gods and goddesses, about proper behavior, and about their obligations to their family and community. This wasn't formal religious education, but rather a gradual absorption of cultural values through daily life and storytelling. Children also learned practical skills that we might consider advanced for their age. By their early teens, most Viking children could navigate by the stars, predict weather patterns, identify edible plants, and perform various crafts and trades. They were expected to be competent and self-reliant in ways that might seem demanding by modern standards. The transition to adulthood was gradual rather than sudden. Children took on increasing responsibilities as they grew older, and by their mid-teens, they were essentially junior adults who could contribute meaningfully to their family's survival and prosperity. This gradual transition helped ensure that young Vikings were well prepared for the challenges of adult life. Family relationships extended beyond the immediate household to include extended family, friends, and allies. Children learned to navigate these complex social networks and to understand their obligations and opportunities within the broader community. These relationships were crucial for survival and success in Viking society, and children who failed to learn proper social skills were at a serious disadvantage. The love and care that Viking parents showed for their children is evident in the archaeological record. Children were buried with toys, jewelry, and other personal items that show they were valued and mourned when they died. The elaborate grave goods found with some Viking children suggest that they were considered full members of the community, not just property of their parents. Viking childhood was challenging but not joyless. Children had responsibilities, but they also had protection, education, and affection. They were prepared for a harsh world, but they were also given the tools and support they needed to thrive in that world. The result was a generation of adults who were competent, confident, and capable of maintaining the complex society that their parents had built. So let's talk about Viking religion and spirituality, because this is where things get absolutely wild. Forget everything you think you know about Norse mythology from Marvel movies. Real Viking religion was way more complex, personal, and frankly bizarre than anything Hollywood could dream up. These people didn't just worship a handful of famous gods, they lived in a universe absolutely packed with supernatural beings who were constantly meddling in human affairs. The Viking cosmos was like a supernatural soap opera, with multiple dimensions, time travel, and characters who kept dying and coming back to life. At the center was Yggdrasil, the world tree, which wasn't just a tree but basically the entire universe's nervous system. This cosmic tree connected 9 different worlds, each with its own inhabitants, rules, and drama. Asgard was where the gods lived and threw their legendary parties. Midgard was the human world, basically Earth, but with more monsters. Jotunheim was giant territory, where the gods' enemies lived and plotted revenge. And then there were 6 other worlds that most Vikings probably couldn't keep straight either. But here's what's really interesting: Vikings didn't just worship these gods from a distance. They had personal relationships with them. Odin wasn't some remote deity sitting on a cloud. He was that sketchy uncle who showed up unexpectedly, gave you cryptic advice, and then disappeared with half your livestock. He was known for wandering around Midgard in disguise, testing people's hospitality and wisdom. Fail his test, and you might find your crops mysteriously failing. Pass it, and you might wake up to find your enemies mysteriously dead. Thor was the people's champion, the god you called on when you needed practical help. Got a problem with giants? Call Thor. Need good weather for your crops? Thor's your guy. Want to win a fight? Better make an offering to the thunder god. But Thor wasn't some perfect superhero. He was basically a cosmic jock with anger management issues and a drinking problem. The stories about him are hilarious. There's one where he has to dress up as a bride to get his hammer back from a giant who stole it. Picture Chris Hemsworth in a wedding dress, and you're getting close to the actual mythology. Freyja was the goddess of love, fertility, and war, because apparently Vikings couldn't imagine romance without the possibility of violence. She was incredibly powerful, and not someone you wanted to mess with. She owned a cloak made of falcon feathers that let her fly, and she had first pick of the warriors who died in battle. Half went to Odin's Valhalla, but the other half went to Freyja's Hall, Efa Levanger, which was apparently the cooler afterlife destination. But the gods were just the tip of the supernatural iceberg. Vikings believed in land spirits, house spirits, ancestor spirits, and various other supernatural beings that had to be kept happy through offerings and proper behavior. Every farm had its own protective spirit that needed regular attention. Disrespect your land spirit, and your crops would fail, your animals would get sick, and your all would turn sour. It was like having an invisible, supernatural landlord who was always watching and judging your life choices. The house spirits were even more personal. These were supernatural beings that lived in your home and helped with daily tasks if you treated them right. Leave out some food for the house spirit, and you might wake up to find your chores mysteriously done. Forget to make offerings, and you'd find your milk sword, your bread burned, and your tools mysteriously broken. It was like having a supernatural roommate with very specific expectations about cleanliness and respect. Ancestor worship was huge in Viking culture. Dead family members weren't really gone, they were just living in a different location and occasionally dropping by to check on things. Vikings built special seats for their ancestors and left out food and drink for them during important occasions. They also consulted their ancestors for advice and guidance, especially during difficult times. The practice of Sida, a form of magic and divination, was central to Viking spirituality, but it was also controversial. Sida practitioners, usually women called Violavars, could see the future, communicate with spirits, and influence events through magical means. But Sida was also associated with sexual taboos and gender bending that made some Vikings uncomfortable. Male Sida practitioners were often viewed with suspicion and sometimes accused of being unmanly. Viking religious practices were surprisingly personal and flexible. There were no churches, no organized priesthood, and no official doctrine. Instead, religion was practiced in homes, at outdoor shrines, and during community gatherings. Everyone was essentially their own priest, responsible for maintaining their relationship with the gods and spirits. Sacrifices were a regular part of Viking religious practice, but they weren't just about killing animals. Vikings sacrificed food, drink, weapons, jewelry, and other valuable items to the gods. The most common sacrifice was probably ale or mead poured out as an offering. Animal sacrifices happened during major festivals or in times of crisis, and the meat was usually eaten afterward. It was a religious feast, not just a waste of good food. Human sacrifice did happen, but it was rare and usually reserved for the most extreme circumstances. The famous bog bodies found in Scandinavia, perfectly preserved human remains found in peat bogs, may be evidence of ritual human sacrifice, though scholars debate whether these people were criminals, volunteers, or victims of political violence. The Viking calendar was organized around religious festivals that marked important transitions in the agricultural year. Winter nights celebrated the beginning of winter and honored the ancestors. Yule was the midwinter festival that lasted for 12 days and involved massive amounts of eating, drinking, and gift-giving. Sabbat honored the female spirits who protected the community. These festivals weren't just religious observances, they were community bonding experiences that reinforced social relationships and cultural values. So let's talk about Viking law and justice. Because their legal system was way more sophisticated and democratic than you'd expect from a bunch of supposedly savage warriors. Vikings didn't just settle disputes with axes and attitude, they had complex legal codes, democratic assemblies, and surprisingly progressive ideas about justice and individual rights. The foundation of Viking law was the Thing, and again, get your mind out of the gutter. The Thing was the local assembly where free men gathered to make laws, settle disputes, and conduct community business. It was basically democracy in action, complete with all the arguing, politicking, and compromise you'd expect from any democratic system. The Thing met at regular intervals, usually outdoors at a designated location that was considered sacred and neutral. Everyone who attended was under the protection of the Thing peace, which meant that violence was strictly forbidden during the proceedings. Break the Thing peace, and you'd face serious consequences, including possible outlawry, basically being kicked out of society and declared fair game for anyone who wanted to kill you. The legal proceedings were surprisingly formal and sophisticated. Cases were presented by the parties involved, witnesses were called, and evidence was examined. There were specific procedures for different types of cases, and everyone was expected to follow the rules. Vikings even had something like lawyers, skilled speakers, who could represent others in legal proceedings. But here's where it gets interesting. Viking law was based on compensation rather than punishment. If you injured someone, you didn't go to jail, you paid them money. If you killed someone, you paid their family a wergild, literally, man price. That was calculated based on the victim's social status and the circumstances of the death. This system was designed to prevent blood feuds by giving the injured party a way to get satisfaction without resorting to violence. The amounts of compensation were precisely calculated and widely known. A free farmer might be worth 200 silver pieces, while a jarl might be worth 600. A thrall was worth much less, reflecting their lower social status. Women's compensation was usually equal to men of the same social class, which was actually quite progressive for medieval times. But the system wasn't just about money. There were also different categories of offences that required different types of compensation. Some crimes were considered so serious that they couldn't be compensated with money alone. These were called uncompensatable crimes and could result in outlawry or other severe punishments. Outlawry was the ultimate punishment in Viking society. An outlaw was literally outside the law, they had no legal protection, and could be killed by anyone without consequences. They couldn't own property, couldn't participate in legal proceedings, and couldn't receive help from their family or friends. It was social death, and for many people, it was worse than actual death. But outlawry wasn't permanent in all cases. Lesser outlaws might be banished for a specific period. 3 years was common, after which they could return and resume their normal lives. Greater outlaws were banished permanently and could never return to their homeland. The legal system also recognized different types of evidence and testimony. The testimony of free men was worth more than that of thralls or women, but women and thralls could still testify in legal proceedings. There were also various forms of oath, taking an ordeal, that were used to determine guilt or innocence when the evidence was unclear. One of the most interesting aspects of Viking law was the concept of collective responsibility. If someone committed a crime and couldn't pay the compensation, their family and kinsmen were responsible for making up the difference. This created strong incentives for families to keep their members in line and to help resolve disputes before they escalated to violence. The legal system also dealt with a wide range of civil matters, property disputes, inheritance issues, marriage and divorce, and commercial transactions. Vikings had sophisticated rules about land ownership, water rights, and the use of common resources. They also had detailed regulations about trade, including standards for weights and measures and penalties for fraud. Women had significant legal rights in Viking society, especially compared to other medieval cultures. They could own property, initiate divorce proceedings, and represent themselves in legal matters. A woman who was divorced or widowed had considerable autonomy and could manage her own affairs without male supervision. The legal system was also flexible and adaptive. Laws could be changed by the thing if circumstances required it, and new situations were dealt with by extending existing legal principles or creating new ones. This flexibility allowed Viking law to evolve and adapt to changing conditions. Legal proceedings were public events that served important social functions beyond just resolving disputes. They were opportunities for the community to come together, reaffirm shared values, and demonstrate the principles of justice and fairness that held society together. They were also entertainment. Vikings enjoyed a good legal argument as much as they enjoyed a good story or a good fight. The influence of Viking law extended far beyond Scandinavia. Wherever Vikings settled, Iceland, the British Isles, Normandy, Russia, they brought their legal traditions with them. Many of these traditions were incorporated into local legal systems and influenced the development of law in these regions for centuries to come. So let's talk about Viking trade and commerce, because these people weren't just raiders and farmers, they were some of the most successful international businessmen of the medieval world. The Viking trade network stretched from Greenland to Constantinople, from the Arctic Circle to North Africa, and it was more sophisticated and extensive than most people realize. Vikings were basically the medieval equivalent of global entrepreneurs. They identified market opportunities, developed supply chains, established trading posts, and created commercial relationships that spanned continents. They were willing to travel incredible distances and take enormous risks to find new markets and new products to trade. The foundation of Viking commerce was their superior maritime technology. Viking ships were centuries ahead of their time, fast, seaworthy, and capable of navigating both open oceans and shallow rivers. This gave Vikings access to markets that other merchants couldn't reach and allowed them to transport goods more efficiently than their competitors. But it wasn't just about the ships. Vikings also developed sophisticated navigation techniques that allowed them to sail out of sight of land for days or weeks at a time. They used the sun, stars, wind patterns, and even the behavior of birds and sea creatures to find their way across vast expanses of ocean. They had primitive but effective instruments like sun compasses and crystal navigation, aids that helped them maintain their course in cloudy conditions. The goods that Vikings traded were incredibly diverse. From Scandinavia, they exported amber, furs, iron, and slaves. Amber was particularly valuable. This fossilized tree resin was prized throughout Europe and the Islamic world for its beauty and supposed magical properties. A single piece of high-quality amber could be worth more than a farm. Furs were another major export. Vikings had access to some of the world's best fur-bearing animals: Arctic foxes, martens, beavers, and seals. These furs were in high demand in warmer climates, where they were symbols of wealth and status. A good fur coat could make you look like medieval royalty, assuming you could afford one. Iron was crucial to the medieval economy, and Vikings had some of the best iron deposits in Europe. They developed sophisticated techniques for extracting and processing iron ore, and Viking iron and steel products were renowned for their quality. Viking weapons and tools were exported throughout Europe and beyond. And then there were the slaves. This is the dark side of Viking commerce that we can't ignore. Vikings captured slaves during raids and also bought them from other sources. These human beings were then sold in markets throughout Europe and the Islamic world. The slave trade was enormously profitable and was one of the main drivers of Viking expansion and exploration. But Vikings weren't just exporters, they were also importers who brought exotic goods back to Scandinavia. Silk from China, spices from India, silver from the Islamic world, wine from France, and countless other luxury items found their way to Viking markets. These imports weren't just for the wealthy, even ordinary Vikings could afford some exotic goods thanks to the profits from trade. The Viking trade routes were extensive and well established. The eastern route went down the Russian rivers to the Black Sea and Constantinople, where Vikings traded with the Byzantine Empire. The western route went to the British Isles, France, and Spain, and eventually to North America. The southern route went through the Mediterranean to North Africa and the Islamic world. These weren't just occasional trading expeditions. They were regular commercial operations that required careful planning, significant investment, and considerable expertise. Viking merchants had to understand different currencies, languages, and legal systems. They had to negotiate with local authorities, arrange for security, and manage complex logistics. Viking trading posts and settlements served as commercial hubs that facilitated trade between different regions and cultures. Places like Dublin, York, and Kiev became major commercial centers where merchants from all over the known world came to buy and sell goods. These settlements were melting pots of different cultures and languages, united by the common language of commerce. The Vikings also developed sophisticated financial instruments that made long-distance trade possible. They had systems for extending credit, transferring money, and sharing risks. They formed partnerships and joint ventures that allowed them to pool resources and share the costs and benefits of trading expeditions. Viking merchants were also innovators who constantly looked for new opportunities and new ways of doing business. They were among the first Europeans to establish regular trade relations with the Islamic world, and they played a crucial role in connecting Europe with Asia and Africa. They were also pioneers in the exploration and colonization of new territories, always looking for new sources of valuable goods. The social status of merchants in Viking society was high, especially for those who were successful. A wealthy merchant could achieve the same social standing as a successful warrior or a prosperous farmer. Merchant families often intermarried with noble families, and successful merchants could use their wealth to acquire land and political influence. But trading was also dangerous. Viking merchants faced pirates, storms, hostile locals, and the constant risk of losing their entire investment. Many trading expeditions ended in disaster, with the merchants losing their goods, their ships, and sometimes their lives. The potential rewards were enormous, but so were the risks. The Viking approach to commerce was pragmatic and flexible. They were willing to trade with anyone who had something they wanted, regardless of religion, ethnicity, or political affiliation. They traded with Christians, Muslims, pagans, and anyone else who was willing to do business. This pragmatic approach allowed them to build commercial relationships that transcended cultural and religious boundaries. So let's talk about Viking warfare and military culture, because while most Vikings were peaceful farmers and traders, the warrior culture was absolutely central to their identity and had a huge impact on daily life, even for those who never picked up a sword. The popular image of Vikings as bloodthirsty berserkers charging into battle with no strategy or discipline is completely wrong. Real Viking warfare was sophisticated, tactical, and highly organized. Vikings were professional soldiers who trained constantly, developed advanced military technologies, and used complex strategies that often outmaneuvered their enemies. The foundation of Viking military success was their superior mobility. Viking longships could appear suddenly on any coastline, strike quickly, and disappear before defenders could organize a response. This hit-and-run tactics allowed small Viking forces to defeat much larger armies by avoiding pitched battles and focusing on surprise attacks. But Vikings weren't just raiders, they were also capable of large-scale military operations. The Great Heathen Army that invaded England in the 9th century was a massive, well-organized force that conquered entire kingdoms. Viking armies could conduct sieges, fight pitched battles, and maintain control over conquered territories for extended periods. Viking weapons were technologically advanced and beautifully crafted. The famous Viking sword was a masterpiece of metallurgy that combined hardness with flexibility in ways that wouldn't be matched for centuries. These swords were so valuable that they were given names and passed down through generations like family heirlooms. A good sword could cost as much as a farm and was often the most valuable thing a Viking owned. But swords were actually relatively rare in Viking society. Most Viking warriors fought with spears, axes, and shields. The spear was the most common weapon. It was cheaper to make than a sword, easier to use, and effective in both individual combat and formation fighting. Viking spears came in various sizes and styles, from light throwing spears to heavy thrusting weapons. The Viking axe was both a tool and a weapon, and many Vikings carried axes that could be used for both purposes. Battle axes were specially designed for combat, with longer handles and different blade shapes than work axes. The famous two-handed Dane axe was a fearsome weapon that could split shields and armor with devastating effect. Shields were crucial to Viking warfare. The typical Viking shield was round, made of wood with a metal boss in the center, and decorated with paint or metal fittings. Vikings fought in shield walls, formations where warriors stood shoulder to shoulder with their shields overlapping to create a nearly impenetrable barrier. Breaking an enemy's shield wall was the key to victory in most Viking battles. Armor was expensive and therefore relatively rare. Most Viking warriors wore leather or padded cloth armor, with only the wealthy able to afford mail shirts. Helmets were more common than body armor, but even these were often simple iron caps, rather than the elaborate horned helmets of popular imagination. In fact, horned helmets were never used in battle. They would have been impractical and dangerous to the wearer. The berserkers, the famous Viking warriors who fought in a trance, like fury, were real, but they were a small, specialized group rather than typical Viking warriors. Berserkers may have used drugs or alcohol to achieve their altered state, or they may have been suffering from what we'd now recognize as psychological disorders. They were feared and respected, but they were also considered somewhat unstable and were often kept separate from regular troops. Viking military organization was based on the household and the local community. Every free man was expected to own weapons and to be ready to fight when called upon. Local leaders organized their followers into military units, and these units could be combined into larger armies when necessary. This system allowed Vikings to mobilize large forces quickly, while maintaining the flexibility that was crucial to their military success. Training was constant and began in childhood. Boys learned to use weapons as soon as they were old enough to hold them, and they practiced regularly throughout their lives. Even farmers and craftsmen maintained their military skills because they never knew when they might be called upon to defend their homes or join a military expedition. The warrior culture influenced every aspect of Viking society. Courage in battle was the highest virtue, and cowardice was the greatest shame. A man's reputation was largely based on his military prowess, and stories of heroic deeds in battle were told and retold for generations. This created strong incentives for Vikings to seek out opportunities to prove themselves in combat. But Viking warfare wasn't just about individual heroics, it was also about group loyalty and solidarity. Warriors fought not just for personal glory, but for their comrades, their families, and their communities. The bonds formed in battle were considered sacred, and abandoning your comrades was one of the most serious crimes in Viking society. The economics of warfare were also important. Successful military expeditions could bring enormous wealth in the form of plunder, tribute, and slaves. This wealth could be used to buy land, establish households, and gain social status. For young men with limited opportunities at home, joining a military expedition was often the best way to improve their circumstances. Viking warfare also had a strong religious component. Warriors prayed to Odin and Thor for victory, made offerings before battles, and believed that dying bravely in combat would earn them a place in Valhalla. This religious dimension gave Viking warriors a psychological advantage over their enemies, who often faced opponents who literally believed that death in battle was a reward rather than a punishment. The impact of warfare on daily life was significant even for those who never participated in battles. Communities had to be prepared for attacks, which meant maintaining defenses, organizing watch systems, and planning for evacuations. Families had to be prepared for the possibility that their men might not return from military expeditions, and women often had to manage households and farms on their own for extended periods. The warrior culture also influenced Viking art, literature, and social values. The sagas are full of stories about heroic warriors and their deeds, and Viking art often depicted weapons, battles, and warrior imagery. The values of courage, loyalty, and honor that were central to the warrior culture became central to Viking culture as a whole. But it's important to remember that most Vikings spent most of their time on peaceful activities. The warrior culture was important, but it coexisted with equally important cultures of farming, craftsmanship, trade, and family life. Vikings were complex people who could be fierce warriors when necessary, but who also valued peace, prosperity, and community when warfare wasn't required. The legacy of Viking warfare extended far beyond the Viking Age itself. Viking military techniques and technologies influenced the development of warfare throughout medieval Europe. Viking warriors served as mercenaries in armies from Ireland to Constantinople, spreading their military knowledge and expertise throughout the known world. The reputation of Viking warriors became legendary and continues to influence popular culture to this day. Now, let's step back and really think about what all of this tells us about Viking society and human nature more broadly. Because when you look at the complete picture of Viking daily life, the farming, the trading, the family structures, the legal systems, the religious practices, what emerges is something far more complex and sophisticated than the popular image of savage warriors would suggest. The Vikings developed what was essentially a successful multicultural civilization that balanced individual ambition with collective responsibility, local autonomy with international connections, and traditional values with innovative adaptation. They created a society that could simultaneously produce some of the most feared warriors in medieval Europe and some of the most successful merchants and explorers. This wasn't an accident, it was the result of cultural values and social structures that encouraged both personal achievement and community cooperation. Think about the legal system we discussed. The thing wasn't just a court, it was a democratic institution that gave ordinary people a voice in governance and a stake in maintaining social order. The compensation-based justice system wasn't just about avoiding blood feuds, it was about creating incentives for peaceful resolution of conflicts and maintaining social cohesion. These weren't the institutions of a primitive society, they were sophisticated solutions to universal human problems. The same sophistication appears in their economic system. Viking trade networks weren't just about moving goods from one place to another, they were about creating connections between different cultures and facilitating the exchange of ideas, technologies, and innovations. Vikings didn't just raid monasteries, they also established trading posts, founded cities, and created commercial relationships that lasted for centuries. They were cultural intermediaries who helped connect Europe with Asia and Africa. Even their approach to warfare, which is what most people focus on, was more sophisticated than it appears on the surface. Viking military success wasn't based on berserker fury or superior brutality, it was based on superior technology, better organization, and more flexible tactics. They were innovators who constantly adapted their methods to changing circumstances and new challenges. But perhaps most importantly, Viking society was remarkably egalitarian by medieval standards. Women had legal rights and social freedoms that wouldn't be matched in many other European societies for centuries. Slaves could earn their freedom and become full members of society. Social mobility was possible through military service, successful trading, or skilled craftsmanship. This wasn't a rigid caste system where your birth determined your entire life. It was a dynamic society where individual merit could lead to advancement. The religious system also reveals sophisticated thinking about human nature and social organization. The Norse pantheon wasn't just a collection of supernatural beings. It was a complex mythology that explored themes of fate, responsibility, sacrifice, and the relationship between individual desires and collective needs. The gods themselves were flawed, complex characters who faced difficult choices and lived with the consequences of their actions, just like humans. This complexity extended to their approach to cultural differences. Vikings were remarkably tolerant of other religions and customs, at least when it came to practical matters like trade and diplomacy. They were willing to adapt to local customs when it served their purposes, and they often incorporated foreign ideas and practices into their own culture. This wasn't cultural relativism in the modern sense, but it was a pragmatic recognition that different approaches might work in different circumstances. The Viking emphasis on storytelling and oral tradition also reveals something important about their values. The sagas weren't just entertainment. They were a way of preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge, moral lessons, and practical wisdom. They celebrated individual heroism, but also emphasized the importance of loyalty, honor, and community responsibility. They were educational tools that helped shape character and behavior. What's particularly striking is how Vikings balanced seemingly contradictory values. They valued both individual achievement and collective responsibility. They were both fierce warriors and peaceful farmers. They were both conservative traditionalists and innovative adapters. They were both local patriots and international cosmopolitans. This ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously was one of their greatest strengths. This complexity challenges our modern tendency to categorize historical peoples as either civilized or barbaric, progressive or backward. The Vikings were neither saints nor demons. They were complex human beings who created a complex society that had both admirable and problematic aspects. They were capable of great cruelty and great kindness, often within the same community or even the same individual. So what can we learn from all this? Well, first, that historical reality is almost always more complex and interesting than popular stereotypes suggest. The Vikings weren't just violent raiders, just as medieval people weren't just ignorant peasants, and ancient civilizations weren't just primitive societies. Real history is messy, contradictory, and human. Second, that successful societies often develop similar solutions to universal human problems, even in very different circumstances. The Vikings faced the same basic challenges that all human societies face: how to organize economic activity, resolve conflicts, maintain social order, and adapt to changing circumstances. Their solutions were different from ours, but they weren't necessarily less effective. Third, that cultural values and social institutions matter enormously in shaping human behavior and social outcomes. The Vikings weren't genetically different from other medieval Europeans, but their culture encouraged different behaviors and created different opportunities. Their emphasis on individual achievement within a framework of collective responsibility helped create a dynamic, adaptive society. And here's where it gets really interesting when we think about modern connections. Because in many ways, Viking society anticipated some of the characteristics that we associate with successful modern societies. Their democratic institutions, their emphasis on individual rights within a framework of social responsibility, their openness to trade and cultural exchange, their pragmatic approach to problem solving, these are all values that modern societies claim to embrace. But the Vikings also remind us that these values don't automatically lead to peaceful, harmonious societies. Viking democracy coexisted with slavery. Their individual freedom coexisted with significant social inequality. Their cultural tolerance coexisted with occasional extreme violence. They show us that human societies are always works in progress, always struggling to balance competing values and interests. In our modern world, we face many of the same challenges that the Vikings faced, just on a larger scale and with different technologies. How do we balance individual freedom with collective responsibility? How do we maintain social cohesion in diverse, rapidly changing societies? How do we resolve conflicts peacefully while still protecting our interests? How do we adapt to new circumstances while preserving valuable traditions? The Viking approach to these challenges wasn't perfect, but it was often surprisingly effective. Their emphasis on practical solutions over ideological purity, their willingness to adapt and experiment, their recognition that different situations might require different approaches, these are all relevant to contemporary debates about governance, economics, and social policy. Consider their legal system, for example. The emphasis on compensation rather than punishment the focus on restoring social harmony rather than satisfying abstract justice. The recognition that community involvement is essential for effective conflict resolution. These ideas are being rediscovered by modern restorative justice movements. Or consider their economic approach. The combination of local self-sufficiency with international trade, the emphasis on building long-term relationships rather than maximizing short-term profits, the recognition that economic success depends on social trust and cooperation. These principles are relevant to contemporary discussions about sustainable development and globalization. Even their approach to cultural diversity has modern relevance. Their pragmatic tolerance, their willingness to learn from other cultures while maintaining their own identity, their recognition that cultural exchange can be mutually beneficial. These attitudes could inform contemporary debates about immigration, multiculturalism, and international relations. But perhaps most importantly, the Vikings remind us that ordinary people living ordinary lives are the real foundation of any society. The farmers who grew the food, the craftsmen who made the tools, the merchants who facilitated trade, the parents who raised children, the neighbors who helped each other through difficult times. These people, not the famous warriors and kings, were the ones who created and sustained Viking civilization. This is a lesson that's easy to forget in our celebrity-obsessed media-saturated world. We tend to focus on the dramatic, the exceptional, the newsworthy, and we lose sight of the quiet, steady work that actually keeps society functioning. The Vikings understood that heroes and leaders are important, but they also understood that a society is only as strong as its ordinary members. So the next time you see a Viking in a movie or TV show, remember that the real Vikings were probably more like your neighbors than like Hollywood superheroes. They worried about their families, worked hard to make a living, tried to be good members of their communities, and hoped to leave the world a little better than they found it. They faced challenges that seem impossibly difficult to us, and they developed solutions that seem remarkably sophisticated when we really understand them. The Viking Age ended more than 1,000 years ago, but the Vikings themselves never really disappeared. Their descendants became the Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, and Icelanders of today. Their cultural influences spread throughout Europe and beyond. Their stories and values became part of the broader Western cultural tradition. And their example of ordinary people creating an extraordinary civilization through hard work, innovation, and cooperation remains relevant and inspiring. In the end, that might be the most important lesson of Viking daily life, that civilization isn't something that just happens, and it's not something that only special people can create. It's something that ordinary people build together, one day at a time, through countless small acts of cooperation, creativity, and care. The Vikings understood this, and that understanding helped them create a society that, for all its flaws, achieved remarkable things and left a lasting legacy. And honestly, in our current world of political polarization, economic uncertainty, and cultural anxiety, we could probably learn a lot from people who figured out how to build a successful, dynamic society while living in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. The Vikings weren't perfect, but they were remarkably good at the fundamental human task of figuring out how to live together. And that's a skill that never goes out of style. So yeah, that's the real story of Viking daily life, not the Hollywood version with the horned helmets and the constant fighting, but the human version with the farming and the families, the laws and the laughter, the struggles and the successes that made up the actual experience of being alive in one of history's most fascinating societies. It's messier than the myths, more complex than the caricatures, and ultimately more interesting than any movie could ever be. Because real life always is.